August 6, 1945. Tokyo, 8:15 in the morning. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, buried nearly 90 feet beneath the palace grounds, a low hum filled the air. Typewriters clicked, radio equipment hissed, and tired officers shuffled papers that all told the same story. Japan was losing. For 3 long years, this underground command center had become a theater of illusions, a place where maps were redrawn to look less desperate and reports rewritten to sound less grim. But that morning, a single decoded transmission would pierce the fantasy and force Japan's leaders to face a truth they had spent the entire war denying. A communications officer, Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto, burst through the steel door without the customary bow, a breach of protocol so shocking that every head turned. In his trembling hands was a decoded message from Hiroshima. It was short, fragmented, and terrifying. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The message cut off mid-sentence. General Yoshiro Umezu, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, read it 3 times. At first, he assumed Hiroshima had suffered the largest conventional bombing raid of the war. Perhaps 500 American aircraft dropping incendiaries. It was the only explanation that made sense. But by mid-morning, additional intelligence shattered that theory. Weather reconnaissance had reported just 3 B-29 bombers over Hiroshima. Not 300, 3. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, head of the Naval General Staff, stood before a massive wall map filled with colored pins marking every known American position in the Pacific. For years, his intelligence officers had become masters at predicting U.S. operations. They knew formation sizes, bombing patterns, and payload capacities by heart. Nothing, not a single American tactic in the last 3 years, suggested that 3 aircraft could destroy an entire city. At 10 a.m., reconnaissance pilots flying toward Hiroshima reported something none of them had ever seen before. A strange, towering cloud, glowing with hues of orange, purple, and violet, rose higher and higher into the sky, visible for more than 100 miles away. It pulsed, alive with an eerie internal light. When Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first eyewitness report around 11:30, his secretary wrote down every word. A railway official, 15 miles outside Hiroshima, described a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. A wave of pressure had ripped the ground apart, knocking trains off their tracks. The city's heart, he said, had simply disappeared, replaced by a vast firestorm that lit the mountains. By 2 p.m., the Supreme War Council gathered in silence. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who had survived multiple assassination attempts for even whispering about peace, placed the reports before him. His hands trembled. He spoke quietly. "Gentlemen, we must consider what this means." General Korichika Anami, the Minister of War and the most zealous voice for continuing the fight, was the first to respond. American propaganda. They want us to believe they possess weapons they do not have. He insisted Hiroshima had been destroyed by conventional firebombing, a trick to break morale. But Admiral Toyoda interrupted, something almost unthinkable in Japan's rigid hierarchy. 3 aircraft, Anami-san. Our radar tracked them. Our observers saw them. 3. Silence filled the room. In that moment, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. For years, Japan's military strategy rested on a single, dangerous belief. that American industrial power could be overcome by Japanese spirit. The logic was simple. The United States could produce more ships, planes, and tanks. But Japan's soldiers would fight with such fanatic determination that American losses would become politically unbearable. This idea had justified every decision since Pearl Harbor. When America built 300,000 aircraft, Japan told itself their pilots had 10 times the courage. When U.S. factories produced ships faster than submarines could sink them, Japan claimed Americans lacked the warrior's heart. But now, one single bomb had destroyed a city. That wasn't a test of courage. It was a demonstration of capability far beyond anything Japan imagined possible. Colonel Hideaki Sato, one of Japan's most respected intelligence officers, spoke softly during the afternoon briefing. He had spent years calculating America's industrial output. If they can destroy an entire city with a single weapon, he said, then they possess scientific power that renders numbers meaningless. They are not fighting the same war we are fighting. Foreign Minister Togo added what no one wanted to say aloud. And if they have one such bomb, we must assume they have more. The words lingered in the cold air like smoke. What the Council began to realize that day was not merely military defeat. It was civilizational. Japan's entire understanding of modern warfare had just collapsed. They had been fighting a 20th century war with 19th century thinking. And Hiroshima was proof that their enemy, the United States, had not been fighting at full strength. They had been holding back. By nightfall on August 6th, the atmosphere inside Tokyo's underground command center had changed. The air was thick, not with smoke or fear, but with realization. For the first time in the entire war, Japan's most powerful men had no explanation that fit the facts. The reports from Hiroshima kept arriving. Fragments of chaos, radiation sickness no one could name, streets turned to glass, people's shadows burned into walls. Each message made one thing clear. Japan wasn't facing a stronger bomb. They were facing a different world. Colonel Sato, the same intelligence officer who'd warned of America's production power years earlier, returned to the Council that afternoon with numbers that made the room go still. He reminded them that in 1944 alone, America had produced more aircraft than Japan had in the entire war. U.S. factories rolled out 96,000 planes that year, while Japan barely managed 28,000. America had built 41 aircraft carriers. Japan had built 15. The United States had produced 88,000 tanks compared to Japan's 6,000. But now, Sato explained, those numbers didn't even matter anymore. If they can destroy cities one by one, he said, production is no longer the measure of power. The future belongs to those who command science. He paused before adding the words that no officer in that room would ever forget. They are fighting a war of physics. We are fighting a war of spirit. For years, Japan's leaders had told themselves that American power was shallow, that industrial abundance could never match Japanese will. But Hiroshima changed everything. In one morning, every comforting illusion collapsed. Foreign Minister Togo whispered, almost to himself, if they could do this in Hiroshima, what stops them from doing it to Tokyo? No one answered. To understand how shocking this moment was, we must look back to 1941, when the war had just begun. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had warned his government what would happen if they provoked the United States. He had studied in America, at Harvard, in Washington, in their shipyards and factories. He had seen what industrial power really looked like. "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year," Yamamoto said. "But I have no confidence after that." He knew that if Japan woke the American giant, they could never outbuild it, only hope to outlast it. But his warnings were buried under nationalism and blind faith. The Army staff wrote their own story, one built on illusion. They claimed American logistics would collapse across the vast Pacific, that their society was too soft for war, that one Japanese soldier was worth 3 Americans. Each of those beliefs would be shattered, one by one, in the years to come. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers sank in a single day. The official report blamed bad luck. At Guadalcanal, Japanese troops fought ferociously and starved to death. The report blamed local commanders. Every defeat was reinterpreted as a temporary setback. No one dared admit the truth. Japan had entered a war it could not win, not because of courage, but because of math. By August 1945, those comforting lies had become part of Japan's national identity. And then Hiroshima happened, a single flash that exposed every illusion at once. That night, as the Supreme War Council recessed, Admiral Toyota wrote a single line in his notebook. "We have been fighting ghosts. The ghosts of our own delusions." The next morning, August 7th, reconnaissance aircraft finally reached the ruins of Hiroshima. What they photographed would circulate among the military leadership within hours. From above, Hiroshima was unrecognizable. A perfect circle of ash where life once stood. 4 square miles had been erased, not damaged, not destroyed, erased. The analysts compared the images with those from the Tokyo firebombing earlier that year, when 334 B-29 bombers had dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries, killing over 100,000 people. Hiroshima's devastation exceeded that, caused by one bomb. By afternoon, the Supreme War Council met again. But this time, there was something new in the reports, something even more terrifying than the bomb. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan. At midnight Moscow time, the Japanese ambassador had been summoned to the Kremlin. The message was short and brutal. The Soviet Union will consider itself at war with Japan effective August 9th, 1945. For months, Japan's leaders had secretly hoped Stalin would mediate peace with the Allies, preserving at least some part of their empire. That fantasy died with those words. Now, Japan faced annihilation from every direction. America from the east, the Soviets from the north, and the British and Chinese from the south and west. That evening, the mood inside Tokyo's war room was one of quiet collapse. Foreign Minister Togo spoke first. "We have 3 choices," he said. "Surrender unconditionally, be destroyed city by atomic fire, or fight until our nation ceases to exist." He looked around the table. There are no other options. No one objected. Even the most fanatical generals stared at the floor. And then, 2 days later, came Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, a second atomic bomb fell. The last transmission from the Nagasaki Regional Command was brief. City destroyed, casualties catastrophic. And then, silence. For the first time in history, The Japanese high command saw their empire not as eternal, but mortal. The illusion of divine destiny had evaporated in a cloud that glowed over the Pacific. As one admiral wrote that night, "They have shown us what the future looks like. And in that future, there is no place for us." Colonel Hideaki Sato, the man who had spent the war tracking America's industrial output, stood before the council once again. His report was called the Reality Assessment. It had been ready for months, but suppressed by senior officers who feared what it said. Now, after 2 atomic bombings, it was finally allowed to be read. The document laid bare a truth Japan had refused to face. In 1944 alone, America's aircraft production had exceeded Japan's entire war output. Its shipyards were launching new carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. Its factories produced more shells in a week than Japan could manufacture in a month. And behind all that, hidden from the world, was a secret research effort involving more people than the entire Japanese scientific community combined. Sato's voice was steady, but cold as he explained. Their laboratories, he said, employed over 100,000 scientists and engineers. Entire cities have been built for research. We are not fighting the same civilization. He began listing places Japan had never heard of: Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos. American towns that didn't appear on any map, where electricity was consumed on a scale larger than Tokyo itself. The United States had created an entire parallel world dedicated to invention and power. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon. It was proof that America's scientific and industrial machinery had reached a level of coordination that Japan couldn't even imagine. Foreign Minister Togo asked the question that everyone was thinking. How could we not know? Sato's reply was blunt. We did know, Minister. Our intelligence reported their scientific recruitment, their industrial expansion, their secret projects. We intercepted communications and documented everything. But each time, the reports were dismissed as exaggeration. We chose not to believe, because to believe meant admitting we could not win. That sentence lingered in the room. We chose not to believe. It was more than a military failure. It was a national psychology laid bare. For years, Japan had created a world built on selective blindness. They saw what they wanted to see and called it strategy. Admiral Toyota finally spoke. His tone was weary, almost reverent. The Americans fought this war with one hand tied behind their back, he said. They fought Germany and Japan simultaneously while developing weapons beyond comprehension. They produced more war material than we thought physically possible. And they did it while keeping their people fed, their economy thriving, their industries growing. He looked down at his notes before finishing. We are not simply weaker than them. We belong to a different stage of civilization. That admission marked the psychological breaking point. For the first time, Japan's leaders began to understand that their enemy's strength was not merely mechanical. It was systemic. America's democracy, once mocked as weak, had proven itself as the ultimate weapon of coordination. Its open society, its universities, its industries, and its workers had all functioned as one machine of innovation. Japan's tightly controlled hierarchy, so proud of its unity, had crushed creativity, silenced dissent, and suffocated the very intelligence that could have saved it. Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakamizu wrote that night in his diary, "We were fighting an enemy we did not understand. We assumed they thought as we thought, that their limits were our limits. Hiroshima proves we were blind." By August 8th, new intelligence only deepened that blindness. The Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most elite formation, collapsed in days. Reports said Soviet tanks advanced 50 miles a day, unstoppable, their columns filled with American trucks, radios, and supplies, all provided through the Lend-Lease program. Even the Soviet advance was powered by American industry. Japan's final illusion was gone. There would be no rescue from the north, no negotiated peace through Moscow, no miracle counterattack. The empire's borders were closing in from every direction, and every path forward led to extinction. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. Within minutes, another city disappeared. The last transmission Japan ever received from there was a broken message. Second attack. City destroyed. Casualties catastrophic, then static. That day's emergency meeting descended into open acknowledgement of defeat, something unheard of in Japanese military culture. Admiral Yonai, the Navy minister, said plainly, "They can destroy our cities at will, one by one, until nothing remains. We cannot defend against weapons we cannot see until they detonate." General Umezu, head of the army, followed him. The atomic bomb changes everything. We built our strategy on the idea that America must invade to conquer. But now, they don't have to. They can erase us from existence without ever setting foot on our soil. Even General Anami, the most unyielding of them all, could find no argument. His silence said everything. Intelligence analysts estimated that the United States might already possess more atomic bombs. Perhaps 5, perhaps 10. Even if they were wrong, the logic remained the same. If one bomb could destroy Hiroshima and another Nagasaki, Japan's entire defensive doctrine was meaningless. That evening, Emperor Hirohito spoke privately to his advisors. The words he chose would later echo through history. "The unendurable must be endured," he said. "The atomic bombs have shown that continued resistance will result in the annihilation of our people. We must accept what we cannot change." That phrase, "the unendurable must be endured," became the moral foundation of Japan's surrender. It was not just the end of a war. It was the end of an illusion. For years, Japan's leaders had believed that spirit could overcome steel, that courage could defeat capacity, that sacrifice could outweigh science. But as the war drew to its close, the truth stood naked before them. Determination meant nothing against an enemy who possessed both courage and the means to give it form. And in that moment, the men who had once commanded an empire realized that Japan had not been defeated in August 1945. It had been defeated years earlier, the moment it declared war on a nation it never truly understood. In the days following the Nagasaki bombing, the Japanese government sent its surrender offer through Swiss diplomatic channels. The message was hesitant and conditional. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration, but only if the emperor's sovereignty was preserved. The American response, delivered on August 12th, was deliberately ambiguous. It stated that the emperor would remain subject to the authority of the Allied commander, but that his ultimate status would depend on the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. That phrasing, so carefully crafted, threw Japan's leadership into crisis. Hardline generals saw it as humiliation, while moderates saw it as a lifeline. Inside the Imperial Palace, meetings turned into arguments, and arguments turned into pleas. The nation stood at the edge of annihilation. And yet, even then, some still wanted to fight on. General Anami, the Minister of War, argued for continuing resistance. He believed it was better for Japan to die with honor than to surrender in disgrace. Others, like Admiral Yonai and Foreign Minister Togo, countered that fighting further meant nothing less than national suicide. For once, even the emperor broke his silence. In a rare intervention, he told his ministers, "We must bear the unbearable." His voice, calm but heavy, ended the debate. On August 15th, 1945, the emperor's voice was broadcast to the nation, the first time his people had ever heard him speak. Across Japan, millions of citizens gathered around radios, kneeling in silence as the words crackled through static. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must endure the unendurable and suffer what must be suffered. To the Japanese people, those words were both salvation and defeat. The war was over. When the news reached American lines, soldiers stopped firing. Across the Pacific, cities erupted in celebration. But in Japan, the silence was deeper than any bomb. Weeks later, as American occupation forces began landing on the islands, Japan's leaders saw firsthand what they had truly been up against. The sight of U.S. military power was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Battleships filled the harbors, stretching from horizon to horizon. Sky after sky was crowded with aircraft, flying in tight, flawless formations. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who would later sign the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri, wrote in his diary, "The harbor was filled with ships as far as the eye could see. Aircraft blanketed the sky. The Americans did not need to boast. Their presence was enough." When General Yoshijiro Umezu stepped onto the deck of the Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, he realized even the setting of their surrender was symbolic. The battleship had been built in less time than Japan had taken to plan a single naval campaign. It was one of dozens like it. Constructed while the U.S. fought 2 wars and built the atomic bomb. Japan had prepared for war for a decade. America had prepared for victory in barely 2 years. As the occupation began, the full extent of American capacity became visible to the Japanese military observers. They watched as a single U.S. infantry division arrived with more trucks than the entire Japanese army had owned during the war. American logistics were beyond belief. Their supply lines didn't just bring weapons. They brought cold food, medical units, typewriters, telephones, construction materials, even entertainment. Where Japanese soldiers had marched barefoot, Americans drove jeeps on freshly built roads. Where Japan's troops had starved, Americans had Coca-Cola and newspapers flown in daily. The difference wasn't just wealth, it was organization. The American system turned abundance into precision. Colonel Sato, the same intelligence officer who had tried for years to warn Japan's generals, was ordered to compile a final report. He titled it, "Why We Lost." It was a document without bitterness, but filled with truth. "We lost the war in December 1941, Sato wrote. "The day we attacked an enemy we did not understand. Every battle after that was the working out of inevitable mathematics." He laid out the comparison in brutal detail. The United States had produced 88,000 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, over 2.4 million trucks, 17 million rifles, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Japan, by contrast, had produced a fraction of those numbers. Yet what shocked them most was not the quantity, but the ease with which America had done it. The U.S. had managed this while maintaining civilian living standards higher than Japan's peacetime economy. Japan's leaders had believed that democracies were weak, that consumerism made society soft. Now they saw the truth, that the same system which gave Americans comfort and choice also gave them unmatched industrial power. As former Prime Minister Suzuki put it, "We thought we were fighting merchants who valued profit over honor. We were wrong. We were fighting the most productive civilization in human history." When occupation authorities revealed the scale of the Manhattan Project, Japan's scientists were stunned. They learned that the project had cost over $2 billion, more than Japan's entire wartime budget. It had employed over 130,000 people. It had built secret cities powered by more electricity than all of Tokyo. Japan's best physicists realized they could not have built such a weapon even if they had known how. The infrastructure simply didn't exist. The atomic bomb wasn't just a military device. It was evidence of an entire civilization's capacity to coordinate science, industry, and purpose. Admiral Toyota later wrote in his reflections, "We began this war believing democracy made America weak, that diversity made it divided, that wealth made it decadent. We ended the war understanding that democracy gave them unity, diversity gave them talent, and wealth gave them strength. Every assumption we held was not merely wrong. It was the exact opposite of the truth." Some officers, like General Anami, could not live with that truth. On the morning of the surrender broadcast, he took his own life, leaving behind a note that read, "I, with my death, apologize to the Emperor for the crime I have committed. Others, like Admiral Yonai, embrace the future, calling for Japan to abandon militarism forever. The empire that had once defined itself through conquest now began to rebuild through learning. Under American occupation, Japan saw things it had never imagined: an economy driven by innovation, universities open to new ideas, and a government where debate was not weakness but strength." By the late 1940s, as Japan began to recover, many of its surviving leaders finally spoke openly about what they had learned. General Umezu, in testimony given to Allied historians, said, "We lost because we never understood our enemy. We thought their limits were ours. We believed courage could defeat chemistry, that spirit could overcome steel. We were wrong." And then he added one final line, a sentence that captured the entire tragedy of Japan's war. "The atomic bomb was not the cause of our defeat. It was the proof of it." As the American occupation unfolded, Japanese leaders began to see the true nature of the power that had defeated them. It wasn't just the number of bombs or ships. It was a system, a civilization built on ideas Japan had once dismissed: democracy, free inquiry, innovation, cooperation. In meetings with American officials, Japanese officers who once commanded armies now listened to engineers and economists. They saw that America's strength came not from obedience, but from freedom. Scientists debated openly. Journalists criticized leaders without fear. Factory workers had rights, yet worked with purpose. The very chaos Japan's hierarchy had condemned as weakness was revealed as the source of American genius. The realization spread beyond politics. Japan's own scientists, engineers, and intellectuals began to understand how far they had fallen behind. Before the war, Japanese research had been bound by rigid tradition. Innovation required permission. Mistakes brought shame. In America, failure was part of progress. That difference had decided the war long before the first bomb fell. Admiral Toyota wrote in 1946 that Japan's tragedy was not its lack of courage, but its refusal to see reality. "We believed the will to die was superior to the will to think," he said. "And so we died, while they thought." It was a line that would haunt Japan's intellectual class for a generation. For General Umezu and others, the realization came with humility. They admitted that Japan had fought blind, not out of ignorance, but out of arrogance. They had dismissed intelligence reports that contradicted their beliefs. They had silenced scientists who questioned authority. They had mistaken loyalty for wisdom. The war had not only destroyed their armies, it had destroyed their ability to see truth. As American officers toured Japan's cities, they too were struck by what they found. Beneath the ruins, they saw a people capable of extraordinary discipline, artistry, and resilience. General Douglas MacArthur, charged with overseeing Japan's reconstruction, believed that the same qualities that once fueled its militarism could now rebuild it, if guided by the right principles. MacArthur's reforms disbanded the old military, rewrote the Constitution, and established new freedoms. Women gained the right to vote. The press became independent. Education was rebuilt from the ground up. For the first time, Japan began to teach not obedience, but curiosity. And within a single generation, those changes bore fruit. The same nation that had been bombed into ashes became an economic powerhouse, a leader in technology, design, and manufacturing. The factories that once built weapons began producing cameras, cars, and electronics that would define the modern world. Japan, the defeated empire, reinvented itself as a symbol of precision, progress, and peace. Historians later called it the miracle of post-war Japan. But to those who lived through it, it was something simpler: redemption through understanding. They had learned that true power comes not from domination, but from creation, not from blind faith, but from vision. The lessons Japan took from defeat reshaped its identity. Strength was no longer measured in soldiers or steel, but in knowledge, innovation, and unity. In the years that followed, Japan became one of America's closest allies, a transformation no one in that Tokyo bunker in 1945 could have imagined. In interviews decades later, surviving officers and ministers reflected on what the war had taught them. One of them, Colonel Sato, the same intelligence officer who had warned of America's power, summed it up best. "We thought war was a test of courage, but it was a test of understanding, and we failed it." For him, Hiroshima was not just a tragedy, but a lesson written in light, a moment when all illusions burned away, leaving only truth. Japan's defeat had revealed something larger than the fall of an empire. It revealed the true engine of human progress, knowledge guided by humility. Because in the end, courage alone cannot build. Faith alone cannot create. And willpower without wisdom leads only to ruin. The story of Japan's fall and its rebirth remains one of the most powerful reminders in history that the greatest victories do not come from strength, but from learning what strength truly means.